personality, particularly if you're doing ordinary level. But don't forget, you could get a question on the Soviet Union where some of the information on this mind map might be useful for you if you're doing higher level. So what do we know about Lenin? He was the leader of the Russian communists, and a particular faction of the Russian communists called the Bolsheviks. The other faction was called the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks essentially were for armed revolution, and Lenin became the leader of the Bolsheviks in the early 20th century. Other prominent Bolsheviks included Trotsky, Stalin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin. You need to learn those names. They become very important later on when we're looking at Stalin and the Soviet Union. Think about how Lenin rose to power. It was all got to do with the First World War, which changed the nature of European politics. Between 1914 and 1917, Russia fought in the First World War against the Soviet Union, but it went disastrously wrong for Russia. By 1917, Russia was running out of money. The Tsar was deeply unpopular. Lenin, who was in exile in Switzerland, was brought back to Russia to foment revolution by the Germans. There was a revolution in February 1917 which overthrew the Tsar's government, but was democratic and weak, led by Alexander Kerensky. By October of 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power in Russia. They immediately withdrew Russia from the First World War, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was a disaster in terms of Russian policy, but actually did what Lenin was a real realpolitik guy. Whatever needed to be done got done. So signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk took Russia out of the First World War and gave Lenin the opportunity to seize control or to maintain control in the Soviet Union, in Russia, which meant fighting the Civil War. The Civil War lasted between 1918 and 1921. The communist forces were called the Reds. The opposition were called the Whites, and they were made up of different disparate groups. So the Tsarists, people who wanted to restore the old regime, Democrats who wanted to turn Russia into a modern republican democracy, some Mensheviks who were opposed to the Bolsheviks. Western allies, Britain and France, sent troops because they didn't want the spreading of revolution to their countries. But essentially, the Whites were too weak to fight the very well organised and motivated communists, and Lenin's communists were victors in the Civil War. Why were they victors? They controlled the internal lines of communication. The white armies were disorganised and didn't cooperate well enough to maximise their power and their operational qualities. Trotsky was a brilliant wartime leader. The Bolsheviks employed ruthless tactics, and they brought in war communism, which is illustrative of those ruthless tactics. What was war communism? It was state control of all national resources in order to win the war. What did it include? State confiscation of food to feed the army, compulsory loss of private property to state ownership, the same thing with any means of production, including industry, state control of trade, state control of banking, and where there were trade unions, they were suppressed if that meant that it interfered with Lenin's ability to win the war. So he was absolutely ruthless, and after the Civil War, Russia was transformed. The name was changed from the Russian Empire in 1922 to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Soviet Union, and the local regions of the former Russian Empire were divided into Soviets, which were controlled from Moscow by the Politburo, and Lenin sat at the top of the Politburo. So he was essentially not a dictator in the sense of, say, Hitler or Stalin, but he was certainly the man who had all the power in those early years of the Soviet Union. And when he had all the power, he introduced totalitarian policies, which you should be familiar with from looking at Mussolini's Italy, from Hitler's Germany, and of course from Stalin's Soviet Union. So what were the totalitarian policies? Ban all political parties except for the Communist Party. Use the secret police, they were called the Cheka, and Felix Dzerzhinsky was the first controller of the Cheka, which crushed any opposition. Indoctrinate young people, use propaganda to spread the message of suffer now to inherit the workers' paradise in the future. Youth organisations were organised. The Komsomol brought young people into the party, and young people were influenced by a new school curriculum which taught communist policies in things such as economics and history. Lenin died in 1924 before his work was done. He died young in his 50s. Crucially, he left a testament behind him which stated that he did not think that Stalin should become the next leader of the Communist Party, but Stalin suppressed that last testament. He formed a triumvirate with Zinoviev and Kamenev to sideline Trotsky. And one of the things he did brilliantly was to foment the cult of Lenin, so that Lenin became this godlike figure in the Soviet Union, and Stalin created this myth that he and Lenin were really close in order to gain support. If you want to know all that, I think you'd be sucking diesel. Have a good bank holiday.